The large mansion on Hillcrest Avenue stood quiet and empty most days. Sure, it had beautiful furniture, huge rooms, and everything money could buy, but laughter rarely filled its halls. Robert, the owner, had everything a person could want, except someone to share it with. At 45, Robert had just sold his tech company for millions. He'd spent 15 years building it from nothing, working day and night until his dream became real. Now he had more money than he could spend in a lifetime, but something important was missing. One rainy Tuesday, Robert's assistant reminded him about a charity dinner he promised to attend. It was for a local foster care center, and Robert had only agreed to go because a business partner had asked him. He almost cancelled. These events were always the same. People in fancy clothes pretending to care, writing checks they'd forget about the next day. But something made him go. Maybe it was the dream he had of his late mother the night before, or maybe it was just that his big house felt especially empty that day. The event was held at the foster center itself, not some fancy hotel. As Robert walked through the doors, small decorations made by children hung from the walls. Hand-painted signs welcomed the visitors, and Robert noticed the genuine care that had gone into making this place feel like home. "Would you like to meet some of our children?" asked Mrs. Thompson, the center's director, after Robert had made a larger donation than anyone expected. "I don't think," Robert began, but Mrs. Thompson was already leading him down a hallway. In a small room with bright yellow walls, 7 girls sat together. The oldest, about 12, was reading a book to the youngest ones. When they noticed Robert and Mrs. Thompson, they grew quiet. "These are the Wilson sisters," Mrs. Thompson explained quietly. "They lost their parents in a car accident 8 months ago. We've been trying to keep them together, but—" Robert nodded, understanding the unspoken problem. Finding a home for 7 siblings was nearly impossible. The oldest girl stared at Robert with eyes that seemed much older than her years. She held the youngest protectively, as if she expected Robert to take her away. "Hello," Robert said awkwardly. He wasn't used to talking with children. None of the girls responded, but the youngest one, no more than 4 years old, peeked out from behind her sister's arm. "I'm sorry about your parents," Robert said, immediately regretting his words. What a stupid thing to say. But then the little one spoke up. "Do you know any jokes?" Robert blinked, surprised. "Jokes? Daddy always told us jokes when we were sad," she explained simply. The oldest sister shushed her, but Robert felt something shift inside him. He did know one joke, a silly one his father had told him as a child. "What did the ocean say to the beach?" Robert asked. The little girl shook her head. "Nothing, it just waved." It was a terrible joke. But the youngest girl giggled, a sound so pure and unexpected that it seemed to brighten the whole room. Even the oldest sister's expression softened slightly. As Robert left the center that night, he couldn't get the 7 sisters out of his mind. He learned their story from Mrs. Thompson, how they'd been split between 3 different foster homes because no one could take all of them, how they'd only got to see each other once a week, how the oldest had become like a mother to the others. That night, Robert couldn't sleep. His huge empty house seemed to echo with silence. He thought about his own life, filled with meetings, deals, and money, but empty of real connection. He thought about those 7 girls, trying to stay together in a world determined to pull them apart. 3 days later, Robert shocked everyone, his business partners, his friends, even himself, by starting the adoption process for all 7 Wilson sisters. People said he was crazy. They said he had no idea what he was getting into. They said a single man with no parenting experience couldn't possibly raise 7 girls. Robert didn't care what they said. For the first time in years, he'd made a decision that wasn't about money or business. It was about filling his empty house with the one thing it needed most, a family. What Robert didn't know then was that this unexpected decision would change everything, not just for the girls, but for him too. Zoe sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and her laptop. At 17, she was deep into her senior project, a family history assignment that had her digging through old photos and documents. "Dad," she called when Robert walked in with groceries, "do we have any more pictures of my birth parents? I need them for this timeline." "Check the blue box in my office closet," Robert answered, putting away milk and vegetables. "There might be some newspaper clippings too." An hour later, the kitchen had grown quiet. Too quiet. Robert looked up from preparing dinner to see Zoe standing in the doorway, her face pale, holding a yellowed newspaper article. "Zoe, what's wrong?" She stepped forward slowly, placing the paper on the counter. "Did you know my father? Before he died?" Robert froze. The article showed a much younger version of himself shaking hands with Zoe's birth father at a business conference. The headline read, "Tech Startups Forge New Partnerships." "Ah, yes," Robert said carefully, setting down the knife he'd been using to chop vegetables. "I met him a few times through work." "This says he invested in your first company." Zoe's voice was steady, but her eyes were troubled. "It says he was one of your earliest backers." Robert took a deep breath. This moment had lived in his nightmares for years, the moment when his carefully built family might crumble under the weight of a truth he never fully shared. "He was," Robert admitted. "He believed in my ideas when few others did." "So you knew who we were," Zoe said, the pieces connecting in her mind. "When you came to the foster center. When you adopted us, you already knew who we were." Robert pulled out a kitchen chair, suddenly needing to sit down. "Yes," he said simply. Zoe's eyes flashed with anger. "Were we some kind of debt you were paying? Some kind of guilt thing because he died and you got rich?" "No," Robert said firmly. "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" Zoe demanded, her voice rising. "Did you adopt us because you felt sorry for us? Because you owed our dad something?" Robert heard footsteps on the stairs, the other girls attracted by the raised voices. He needed to explain, and quickly. "Sit down, please," he said to Zoe. "I want to tell you the whole story." She hesitated, then sat across from him, arms crossed defensively. The other girls hovered in the doorway, confused but sensing something important was happening. "Your father, James Wilson, was one of my first investors," Robert began, speaking clearly so all the girls could hear. "He was brilliant and kind. We weren't close friends, but I respected him. When my company started to really take off, he had already pulled his investment. He needed the money for medical bills. Your mother had been diagnosed with cancer." Danny gasped softly. This was new information for all of them. "I offered to buy back his shares at a premium, but he refused. He said he'd made his choice and would live with it. A year later, I heard he died in the same accident that took your mother." Robert looked directly at Zoe. "I didn't know about any of you then. I was just another businessman who read about a tragic accident in the paper." "So when did you find out about us?" Zoe asked, her voice a little less hard. 3 years later. I was at a charity event, and someone mentioned the Wilson sisters being separated in foster care. The name caught my attention. I asked a few questions, and when I learned you were James's daughters, I was curious." Robert ran a hand through his hair, remembering. "I arranged to visit the foster center just to see if you were okay. I didn't go there planning to adopt anyone. I just felt I owed it to your father to check on his children. But then I met you, all of you, and something happened that I wasn't expecting." "What?" asked Lily, who had edged closer, her young face serious. Robert smiled gently. "I realized how empty my life was, how all my success meant nothing without someone to share it with. When I saw how you girls stuck together, how you protected each other despite everything you've been through, I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to help." "So you adopted us because you felt sorry for us?" Hira said, her voice small. "No," Robert shook his head firmly. "I visited you because I felt connected to your father. But I adopted you because I fell in love with 7 amazing girls who made me laugh and made me want to be a better person." The kitchen fell silent as the girls processed this revelation. Robert waited, his heart pounding. He'd kept this secret for years, afraid they would think his love wasn't genuine. "Why didn't you tell us?" Ruby finally asked. "At first you were all so fragile, so unsure about everything." "I worried you might think I only wanted you because of who your father was, not who you were," Robert explained. "And then we became a real family, and I was afraid of ruining that." "Were you ever going to tell us?" Zoe asked, her voice steadier now. "Yes," Robert said honestly, "when you were all a little older. I was waiting for the right time." Tara stepped forward, looking at the newspaper clipping. "So our dad knew your company would be successful, even when others didn't." Robert nodded. "He had great instincts. He saw potential others missed. Like you saw in us, Danny said quietly. The tension in the room shifted slightly. Zoe was still watching Robert carefully, but some of the anger had left her eyes. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, Robert said. But I need you all to know something important. Whatever brought us together, fate, coincidence, your father's connection to me, what kept us together was love, real love, not obligation or guilt. How do we know that's true? Zoe challenged, though her voice had lost its edge. Robert looked at her steadily. Because love is a choice you make every day. And I've chosen all of you, every single day, for 7 years. Not because of who your father was, but because of who you are. There was another long silence, and then Lily walked over and climbed into Robert's lap, the way she used to when she was smaller. I believe you, Dad, she said simply. Slowly, the other girls moved closer too. Not everything was resolved. Robert could see questions still lingering in Zoe's eyes, but the family remained intact. Sometimes the truth, however complicated, was better than a well-intended secret. Later that night, as Robert checked on each girl before bed, he found Zoe in her room, looking at old photos of her parents. He would have been proud of you, Robert said softly from the doorway. Of all of you. Zoe looked up, her eyes red but clear. I wish I could remember him better. I only met him a few times, Robert said, but I remember he talked about his girls constantly. He loves you more than anything. Like you do? Zoe asked, watching his face carefully. Like I do, Robert confirmed. That's one thing your father and I definitely had in common. The day the 7 sisters arrived at Robert's mansion was filled with wide eyes and whispered words. The girls stood in the massive entrance hall, holding small backpacks with everything they owned inside. The youngest one, Lily, clutched a worn teddy bear missing one eye. The oldest, Zoe, kept her sisters close, her face a mask hiding her true feelings. Let me show you around, Robert said, his voice a bit shaky. He'd faced tough business deals and spoken to rooms full of investors, but nothing had made him as nervous as this moment. The girls followed him silently, like a line of ducklings, as he showed them the kitchen with its huge fridge always open for snacks, the living room with the biggest TV they'd ever seen, and the backyard with a swing set he had installed just yesterday. And now for the most important part, Robert said, leading them upstairs. He opened the first door, revealing a bedroom painted soft purple with butterfly decorations. This one's for you, Lily. The little girl's mouth fell open. For me. Just me. Just you, Robert nodded, watching as she slowly walked in, touching the bed like it might disappear. One by one, he showed each sister her own room, each painted a different color, each decorated based on the little information Mrs. Thompson had shared about their interests. For Zoe, a blue room with bookshelves already filled with novels. You don't have to pretend, Zoe said when they were alone for a moment. No one does all this unless they want something. Robert looked at her, seeing the hurt and mistrust in her young eyes. You're right to be careful, he said simply. I don't blame you. I wouldn't trust me either. That first night was awkward. Dinner was quiet except for forks scraping plates. Robert tried to make conversation, but years of talking business hadn't prepared him for talking to children. When Lily spilled her milk, she froze in fear, eyes wide with panic. It's okay, Robert said quickly, grabbing a towel. You know what? Watch this. He purposely knocked over his own glass, making an even bigger mess. The girls stared in shock, then the second youngest, Nia, started giggling. Soon all of them were laughing as Robert slipped dramatically on the wet floor. But the laughter didn't fix everything. That night, Robert was woken by crying. He found Lily having a nightmare, calling for her mother. Awkwardly, he sat on the edge of her bed, not sure what to do until she crawled into his lap, still half asleep, and he rocked her until she settled. The next morning, he called for help. By afternoon, his home was filled with experts, a child psychologist who specialized in grief, a teacher to help assess their education needs, and a grandmother-type nanny who took one look at his bewildered face and said, "You've got heart, but you need hands." Days turned into weeks. Robert learned that Zoe loved astronomy, so he bought a telescope for the balcony. He discovered that Nia could spend hours drawing, so he set up an art corner in the sunroom. The middle sisters, twins Tara and Kira, were inseparable and loved sports, so he cleared space in the yard for a soccer field. Dunny, the second oldest, was quiet but lit up around animals, so he arranged volunteering at an animal shelter. And little Ruby, just a year older than Lily, followed her oldest sister everywhere, trying to be as brave and strong. It wasn't always smooth. The first parent-teacher conference left Robert overwhelmed with information about reading levels and math skills. The first time he tried to do Lily's hair, she ended up with lopsided pigtails that made the other girls collapse with laughter. And when Zoe slammed her door and yelled she hated her new life, Robert sat outside her room for 2 hours until she finally opened it a crack. "I don't know how to be a dad," he admitted through that small opening. "But I'm trying, and I'm not going anywhere." Slowly, the mansion transformed. Homework covered the dining table. Shoes in 7 different sizes cluttered the hallway. The fridge was plastered with artwork and spelling tests. The formal living room became a fort-building zone on rainy weekends, and Robert's home office now had a small desk where Zoe could read quietly while he worked. One evening, about 3 months after they arrived, Robert was in the kitchen trying to follow a recipe for spaghetti when he heard it, real, genuine laughter echoing through the house. He followed the sound to find all 7 girls in the TV room having a pillow fight, feathers flying everywhere. They froze when they saw him, immediately expecting trouble. Instead, Robert grabbed a pillow and said, "You know, I was the pillow fight champion of my dorm in college." "Prove it," challenged Kira. And seconds later, Robert was being bombarded from all sides by giggling girls. 10 years had passed since 7 small girls with frightened eyes had walked into Robert's mansion. Tonight, the same mansion sparkled with lights and laughter as guests gathered to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Chambers Family Foundation. Under a banner reading "Building Bridges for Foster Children," elegantly dressed people mingled and chatted. At the center of it all stood Robert, now in his mid-50s, his hair more salt than pepper, greeting donors and supporters. "Dad," called a voice, and Robert turned to see Lily, now 14 and as tall as his shoulder, weaving through the crowd. "The photographer wants all of us for the family picture." Robert excused himself and followed Lily to where his other daughters waited. Tara and Kira, both 22 and home from college for the event, stood chatting with Dani, who at 20 had become a passionate advocate for foster care reform. Ruby, 19 and studying music, adjusted her earrings while Naya, 21, straightened Robert's tie with a critical artist's eye. And then there was Zoe, 22 and graduating from university next month with honors in law. She'd grown into a poised young woman who carried herself with quiet confidence. "There you are," she said, smiling at Robert. "We can't do this without you." As they posed for photos, Robert marveled at how different they all looked from those small, frightened girls he'd first met. They'd grown into strong, accomplished young women. And he had grown too, from a lonely millionaire to the proud father of 7 remarkable daughters. After the photos, it was time for the main event. The foundation, which Robert had started 5 years ago with his daughter's help, had grown into one of the country's leading advocates for keeping sibling groups together in foster care. Zoe stepped to the microphone first. In her elegant blue dress, she commanded the room's attention without effort. 10 years ago, she began, "My sisters and I were statistics, 7 siblings likely to be separated forever in the foster care system. Today, we stand before you as witnesses to what's possible when someone refuses to accept that broken system." She looked at Robert, her eyes warm. "Many people have asked us over the years if we feel lucky that a wealthy man chose to adopt us. The answer is yes, but not for the reasons they think." Dani stepped forward next. "We weren't lucky because we suddenly had nice clothes or big bedrooms," she said. "We were lucky because we found someone who fought to keep us together when everyone else said it was impossible." Ruby took the microphone after her. "We were lucky because we found someone who made us laugh when we'd forgotten how," she said. "Someone who burned pancakes and told terrible jokes and never gave up, even when we pushed him away." One by one, each sister shared her part of the story. Naya talked about finding her voice through art when words failed her. The twins spoke about learning to trust and to hope again. And Lily, the youngest, spoke last. "I was only 4 when we were adopted," she said simply. "I don't remember much about before. But I do remember the first time I called Robert Dad and how his eyes got all watery. I remember feeling safe for the first time in forever." Finally, it was Robert's turn to speak. He stepped to the microphone, looking out at the crowd, and then back at his 7 daughters. People often tell me how lucky these girls were, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. But they've got it backwards. I'm the lucky one. He paused, collecting himself. 10 years ago, I had everything money could buy and nothing that truly mattered. I was successful by every measure except the ones that count: love, purpose, family. These young women taught me what real wealth looks like, Robert continued. It looks like Zoe staying up all night to help Lily with a school project. It looks like the twins cheering each other through disappointments and victories. It looks like Dani finding her voice and using it to help others. It looks like Nia's artwork that comes straight from her heart and Ruby's music that fills our home. His voice grew stronger. Our foundation has helped keep over 200 sibling groups together in the past 5 years. We've changed laws in 3 states. We've trained hundreds of social workers in new approaches to family placement. But none of that would have happened if these 7 extraordinary young women hadn't first changed me. They took a man who measured success in dollars and taught him to measure it in moments: bedtime stories and soccer games, prom nights and college drop-offs, tears wiped away and laughter shared. The room had grown quiet, caught in the magic of the story unfolding before them. People call me a self-made man because I built a successful company, Robert said. But the truth is, I was remade by these 7 young women who let me be their father. After his speech, as guests mingled and donated generously to the foundation, Robert found himself standing with all 7 daughters in a quiet corner of the room. Nice speech, Dad, said Tara with a grin. Very emotional. Too emotional? Robert asked with a smile. Just right, Ruby assured him, squeezing his arm. Did you really mean all that? Asked Lily. About us changing you? Every word, Robert said seriously. Before you, I was just a rich man. You made me a wealthy one. The 7 sisters exchanged glances, an entire conversation passing between them in looks and small smiles, a language Robert had learned to read over the years. We have something for you, Zoe said finally. She nodded to Dani, who pulled a small wrapped package from her purse and handed it to Robert. Inside was a simple silver frame. The photo showed all 8 of them from their very first Christmas together, awkward and uncertain but trying so hard to be a family. Turn it over, Kira said. Robert did. Engraved on the back were the words, "Family isn't about luck, it's about love. Thank you for choosing us every day for 10 years." Looking at his daughters, these remarkable women who had entered his life as scared children and changed everything, Robert felt that familiar tightness in his chest that he'd come to recognize as pure, overwhelming love. They had all been lucky in their own ways, lucky to find each other, lucky to build something beautiful from broken pieces, lucky to discover that family isn't always about where you start, but where you choose to belong. That night, as feathers still drifted through the air and the cleanup forgotten, Robert realized something. His mansion had finally become a home. 6 months into their new life together, Robert sat at the kitchen table surrounded by school papers, permission slips, and 7 different schedules. He rubbed his tired eyes and took another sip of cold coffee. Who knew raising 7 girls would be harder than running a tech company? You look tired, said Zoe, appearing in the doorway. At nearly 13 now, she had started to open up, though her walls came back up whenever she felt uncertain. Just organizing, Robert said, smiling. Did you know Tara has soccer on the same day Kira has basketball? And they're across town from each other. Zoe sat down across from him. I can take Kira, she offered. I'm old enough to ride the bus with her. Robert looked at her, this girl who had carried so much responsibility for so long. Thank you, but that's my job now. You get to be a kid. Zoe frowned. I'm not a kid. I've been taking care of my sisters since. Since your parents died, Robert finished gently. I know. And you did an amazing job. But now we're a team, okay? Later that week, Robert sat uncomfortably on a tiny chair at Nia's parent-teacher conference. Ms. Chen smiled as she showed him Nia's artwork. She has extraordinary talent for an 8-year-old, but she's still struggling with reading. Robert nodded, making notes in the small notebook he carried everywhere now. It was filled with each girl's likes, dislikes, shoe sizes, allergies, and dreams. We're reading together every night, he explained. Her therapist said it might take time. You're doing great, Ms. Chen assured him. Most children who faced such loss struggle much more. That night was Ruby's turn to choose dinner. She picked pancakes, and the kitchen became a flour-covered disaster zone as Robert let each girl mix her own batter and add whatever toppings she wanted. Dani, usually so quiet, laughed until she snorted when Robert flipped a pancake that stuck to the ceiling. "Dad, you're terrible at this," she said, then froze, realizing what she'd called him. The kitchen went silent. It was the first time any of them had called him Dad. Robert carefully set down the spatula. "Well," he said, his voice a little rough, "if I'm terrible at it, you better show me how it's done." Dani's shy smile returned as she took the spatula, and the moment passed without more weight added to it. But Robert noticed that Zoe watched everything with thoughtful eyes. Bedtime routines had gotten smoother. The younger girls now expected Robert to read them stories, check for monsters under beds, and sing terribly off-key lullabies that made them giggle. The twins always needed to talk about their day, processing every detail until they fell asleep mid-sentence. Dani needed her special night light and her stuffed dog placed just right. Only Zoe kept her distance at bedtime, insisting she was too old for tucking in. But Robert noticed she always left her door cracked open, listening to the stories he told her sisters. One night, after the others were asleep, Robert found Zoe sitting on the back porch, looking at the stars. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, sitting beside her but not too close. "I had a dream about Mom," she said quietly. I can't remember what her voice sounded like anymore. Robert felt his heart squeeze. "I have an idea," he said. The next day, he surprised her with a memory book project. He'd contacted their old neighbors, their parents' friends, and even tracked down old co-workers. Soon, letters, photos, and stories began arriving. Zoe spent hours organizing them, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing as she rediscovered pieces of her parents through others' memories. As fall turned to winter, they created new traditions. Sunday mornings meant pancakes, Monday nights were for movies, the last Friday each month was Adventure Day, when Robert would surprise them with a new experience. Horseback riding, a museum, or even just a hike in the woods. Little Lily had stopped having nightmares every night, though she still crawled into Robert's bed during thunderstorms. The twins had made new friends at school who didn't know them as the orphan girls. Dani had started volunteering at an animal shelter, coming home with stories about puppies and kittens. Ruby had discovered she loved to cook and would stand on a stool beside Robert, seriously explaining that the secret to good cookies was extra love. And Zoe? She still watched, still kept one foot ready to run if needed. But she had joined the science club at school. She had put up posters in her room. And sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, she smiled at the chaos around her. It wasn't perfect. There were still tears, slammed doors, and moments when grief would ambush one of them unexpectedly. Robert still felt completely lost sometimes, wondering if he was doing anything right. One evening, after a particularly rough day when Kira had gotten in trouble at school and Lily had a meltdown over a broken toy, Robert sat alone in the kitchen after everyone was finally asleep. He put his head in his hands, exhausted. "You're not giving up, are you?" came Zoe's voice. Robert looked up to find her watching him from the doorway, her face serious. "Never," he said firmly. "We're family now. Families don't give up." Zoe nodded, then did something she'd never done before. She walked over and gave him a quick, awkward hug. "Good," she whispered. "Because they need you." She pulled away quickly and disappeared upstairs. What she didn't say, but what Robert heard anyway, was that maybe she needed him too. The first day of school after winter break brought a new challenge. Robert drove the girls to school as usual, but when they pulled up to the building, a local news van was parked outside. "What's going on?" Tara asked, looking worried. Robert had been afraid this might happen eventually. Someone had tipped off the media about the millionaire who'd adopted 7 sisters. "Probably nothing," he said calmly, though his stomach nodded. "Let's just get inside quickly." But before they could, a reporter approached with a microphone and cameramen in tow. "Mr. Chambers, could we get a statement about your unconventional family? Why did you adopt 7 black children? Is this some kind of charity project?" Robert stepped between the reporter and the girls. "We're just here for school," he said firmly. "Please respect our privacy." "The public is curious," the reporter pressed. It's not every day a wealthy white bachelor adopts. They're not a story, Robert interrupted, his voice steady but cold. They're children, my children, and we're late for school. Later that evening, the local news ran a piece anyway, Tech Millionaire's Unusual Adoption, Heartwarming Act or PR Stunt. The segment showed old photos of Robert at business events, juxtaposed with a blurry shot of him walking the girls into school. This is stupid, Zoe said, watching the TV with her arms crossed. Why do people care so much? People are curious about things that seem different, Robert explained, turning off the TV. But what they think doesn't matter. What matters is us. But the media attention brought new challenges. At school, the twins came home upset because kids had asked if they were charity cases. Danny's teacher suddenly became overly helpful, treating her like she needed special attention. And the neighbor who had always waved now watched them with obvious curiosity when they played in the yard. Worst was the day Robert took Lily to the park and a woman approached them. "It's so wonderful what you're doing for these children," she said loudly. "So generous. I always tell my husband we should help those less fortunate too." Lily looked up at Robert, confusion in her eyes. "Thank you," Robert said stiffly, "but they're the ones helping me." That night, he sat the girls down for a family meeting. "I know things have been a bit weird lately," he began. "People are saying things that might be confusing or hurtful. Like why you adopted us because we're black and you're not," Zoe said bluntly. Robert nodded. "Yes, like that." "So why did you?" Kira asked. Robert thought carefully. "I adopted you because when I met you, I felt like I'd found the missing pieces of my life. Not because of what you look like, but because of who you are." "But people think it's weird," Ruby said softly. "Some do," Robert agreed. "And some of them might treat you differently because of it. Some might even say mean things. Like Brian in my class," Tara mumbled. "He said you just wanted to look good on TV." Robert felt a flash of anger, but kept his voice calm. "What do you think? Do you think that's why?" Tara shook her head. "No, you hate being on TV. You wouldn't even let them film you at my soccer game." "People will always have opinions," Robert continued. "But we know the truth. We're a family because we choose each other every day. Nothing else matters." The conversation helped, but it didn't solve everything. Robert worried especially about the girls' connection to their heritage. As a white man, there were things he couldn't teach them, experiences he couldn't share. He reached out to Mrs. Thompson from the Foster Center, who connected him with a support group for transracial adoptive families. Through them, he met Ms. Diane, a black social worker who became a trusted friend and advisor. "You're doing fine," she assured him over coffee one day, "but these girls need to see themselves in the world around them. In their books, their toys, their heroes. And they need people in their lives who share their experiences." With Ms. Diane's help, Robert expanded their world. He enrolled Zoe and the twins in a Saturday program at a community center run by Ms. Diane's church. He found a hair salon where the stylists taught him how to properly care for the girls' hair. Their home library expanded with books featuring black main characters and history. Most important was Ms. Diane herself, who came for Sunday dinners and soon became Auntie Di to the girls. She brought her teenage sons who played basketball with the twins and taught Zoe about photography. Her mother, Grandma Pearl, showed Ruby and Lily how to make her famous sweet potato pie. "Your job," Ms. Diane told Robert one evening as they watched the children playing, "is not to pretend differences don't exist. It's to make sure those differences are celebrated, not hidden." One afternoon, Robert picked up Zoe from school to find her eyes red and her face tight with anger. It took half the drive home before she would tell him what happened. "Mr. Peterson asked if I was your maid's daughter," she finally said, voice shaking. "When I said you were my dad, he said, 'Your real dad,' and made air quotes." Robert gripped the steering wheel tightly. "I'm sorry that happened," he said, controlling his anger. "What did you say back?" "I told him you were my real dad. The one who shows up." Robert pulled the car over and turned to face her. "Zoe, you are the strongest person I know. And you're right, being a real parent isn't about DNA. It's about love and showing up every day." Zoe looked at him for a long moment. "And you going to call the school?" "Do you want me to?" She thought about it. "No, I handled it." Robert nodded. "Okay. But if it happens again, we handle it together. That's what family does. As they pulled back onto the road, Zoe said quietly, "People are always going to stare at us, aren't they?" "Probably," Robert admitted. "But let them stare. We know who we are." 5 years had passed since the day 7 small backpacks had been carried into Robert's mansion. The house that once echoed with emptiness now burst with life, laughter, and the occasional teenage door slam. The changes were everywhere. The formal dining room now hosted science projects and art supplies more often than fancy dinners. The living room walls, once covered in expensive art, now displayed school certificates and family photos. And Robert himself had changed most of all. "Dad, have you seen my blue sweater?" called Zoe, now 17 and rushing to get ready for school. She'd grown into a thoughtful young woman who excelled in science and led the debate team. "Dryer," Robert answered, packing lunches with the efficiency of someone who'd made thousands. "Tara, basketball practice is cancelled. Coach just texted me." "But we have the championship next week," Tara protested, grabbing an apple from the fruit bowl. "Flow going around the team," Robert explained. "Better than having half the players sick for the big game." Kira slid into the kitchen on sock-covered feet. "Dad, I need $20 for the field trip." "Forms on my desk already signed," Robert said, handing her a lunch bag with her name written on it. At 49, his hair had some gray now, and he wore glasses for reading, but he moved with the energy of someone much younger. "Has anyone seen my history book?" called Danny from upstairs. At 15, she'd become passionate about civil rights and planned to become a lawyer someday. "Check under your bed." Robert and Zoe called at the same time, then exchanged knowing smiles. The morning chaos continued until all 7 girls had been fed, organized, and sent off to their various schools. Only then did Robert sit down with his now cold coffee and breathe deeply. His phone buzzed with a message from his former business partner, "Missing your expertise. Board positions still open if you're ready to rejoin the real world." Robert smiled, typing back, "Already in the real world. More real than corporate ever was." 5 years ago, he'd been Robert Chambers, tech millionaire. His days had been filled with meetings, investments, and business dinners. Success had been measured in stock prices and profit margins. Now, success looked like Lily's improved reading scores and Ruby's first solo in the school choir. It looked like the twins making friends who genuinely cared about them, not their unusual family situation. It looked like Dani speaking up in class instead of hiding behind her hair. And it looked like Zoe applying to colleges with the confidence of someone who knew she belonged. That afternoon, Robert sat in the school auditorium watching Ruby perform with her choir. His phone was off, his attention entirely on his daughter's proud face as she sang her solo. 5 years ago, he would have been checking emails during such an event if he bothered to attend at all. Next to him sat Ms. Diane, now a close family friend. "Look at her shine," she whispered, nodding toward Ruby. "Remember when she was too shy to order her own food at restaurants?" Robert nodded, feeling that familiar tightness in his chest, a mixture of pride and disbelief that these amazing girls were his family. After the performance, they all celebrated at Ruby's favorite pizza place. The table was loud with overlapping conversations, Lily describing her art project, the twins debating basketball strategies, Dani discussing a book with Ms. Diane, Zoe showing Robert a college brochure, and Ruby accepting congratulations from everyone who stopped by their table. "Your family is beautiful," said an elderly woman at the next table, smiling at the happy chaos. "Thank you," Robert replied, and felt no need to explain anything more. Those who mattered understood, those who didn't never would. Later that evening, with the younger girls in bed and the older ones doing homework, Robert sat in his home office. The room had changed too. Where stock certificates once hung, there were now framed drawings from when the girls were younger. His desk held fewer financial reports and more permission slips. He opened his laptop to check his email and found a message that made him pause. It was from the foster care center where he first met the girls. They were organizing a fundraiser and wanted him to speak about his experience. Robert's first instinct was to say no. Their family story wasn't for public consumption, but then he thought about other siblings separated in the system, other children waiting for homes, and he began to type a response. The next day, he brought it up at dinner. "I've been asked to speak at a fundraiser," he explained, "about our family." "You hate public speaking," Zoe pointed out, reaching for the salad. "I do," Robert agreed. but maybe our story could help other kids. The girls exchanged looks, having one of those silent conversations they'd perfected over the years. We could come too, Danny suggested quietly, if you want. Only if you're comfortable with it, Robert said. This is your story as much as mine. More ours than yours, Tara joked. You just provided the house. And the food, added Kira. And the bad jokes, Ruby chimed in, making everyone laugh. As Robert looked around the table at these 7 remarkable young women who had transformed from frightened, grief-stricken children into confident, caring people, he marveled at how much they'd grown. But in truth, he'd grown more. 5 years ago, he'd thought he was saving them. Now he understood they'd saved him too.